Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Wild Doggies Fan podcast. If you're new here, please like the video, comment down below, subscribe, and stay tuned for all future videos. This is episode 11, and welcome to the off season. Alright, everyone. For today's episode, we're going to cover the Pacific Championships, all news stuff relating to all things around the NRL off season, including signings, players returning, players retiring, coaches ending up in hospital. And of course, we're going to begin part 1 of, I believe, 5 of this season review for each team in the NRL. Without further ado, let's begin. So, the first thing we're going to cover is the Pacific Championships happening this Friday, which is actually my birthday. So, that's going to be a fun way to spend my birthday. Watching the Australian Kangaroos take on Tonga up at Suncorp Stadium. 8:10 p.m. I'm not going to do team lists because for all the teams except Australia, I'm not quite familiar with majority of the names. Oh, there's a few names I know from the Tongan and Fiji side, but from like PNG and a few others, I'm not going to know the names, so I'm not going to cover team lists. I'm just going to do my tips and anytime try scorers because I need footy content to cover because I want this off-season to be quick as possible and the preseason because I want season 2025 to happen pretty much now. But we need to let the players rest, so there's not much we can do about that. Right, so the first game, as I said, Kangaroo vs Tonga. This is on Friday, the 18th of October, my birthday, up at Suncorp Stadium. I'm going to tip the Kangaroos, and I'm going to tip them 13 plus here. I think Mal has got a good team together. We've got the likes of a bunch of premiership winning players in our team. We've got, the likes of Dylan Edwards. He's not a premiership winning player, but Mitch Moses. He's making his return since Origin Game 3. We got both our wingers are gun wingers with Xavier Coates and Zach Lomax. You got the hammer in the centers, which is going to be unreal. Our forward pack's a bit smaller than Tonga's, but I still think they'll get the job done. I think our outside backs is what's going to really carry this team. I think they're going to do a lot of the big stuff to get us to win, because I feel like Tonga's forward pack is actually a bit better than ours. They're going to got the likes of Gutho and a few other boys in there who are just absolute freaks, and they're a big forward pack, and that's a big thing for Tonga. But I do think that Australia, the Kangaroos, their outside backs they're gonna kill it. Just having a look now at their forward pack. You got the likes of AFB, Felice Kafusi, Big Ola Kawatu, Eli Katoa, Jason Taumalolo. Like, that's some big bodies. But we have our own big bodies. We have, Isaiah Yeo, Cameron Murray, Angus Crichton, Lindsay Collins, Pat Carrigan. I think the big inclusion for me is having Matt Burden on the bench. I think that's a good interchange. I think Mal has learned the lesson that Madge never got to learn. And, having someone, not a big body, but someone on the bench you can put in case anything does happen, that's a good cover point. Because, if Hammer goes down, if Turbo goes down, if, Dearden goes down, you can bring in Matt Burden. And he's just good cover. So, for my tips, I'm tipping the Kangaroos to win this by 13 plus. Australia normally, except minus last year, losing 30-0 to the Kiwis, Australia's pretty good at winning these kind of games. So I'm going to go Australia 13 plus. And from anytime try scores, I'm actually going to do 3 for these games because it's just something interesting. It only happens, Pacific Championship just happens once a year. So I had to pick I'll do 3 try scorers for each game. So for this game, I'm going to do the Hammer, Zach Lomax, and Matt Burden to score. Matt Burden's a bit of a rogue one because he might not play much. But, I got to chuck the Doggies player, the one Doggies player representing Australia. You just got to do it. Moving on to the second game of the week. This is on the Saturday at 7:10 p.m. in HFC Bank Stadium, Suva. I don't know if I even pronounced that right. Fiji versus PNG. So that's going to be an interesting game. I don't know I literally don't think I know anyone from the PNG side. So I'm just going to tip purely because I know the names. I know they're good players. I'm tipping Fiji 13 plus. You got lots of Taruva, Makasivo, Kurt Donahue, Tuikama Kamika, Viliami Kikau. Like, you got some big names in here. So for my tips, or for my predictions, sorry, I'm going to go Fiji 13 plus. I'm going to do Micah Sivo, Viliami Kikau, and Sunya Taruva, each to score a try. I think those three boys are all going to play a big role in this game. So yeah, that's my tips, predictions, and coverage for the Pacific Championships. Looking forward to this. This happens only, once a year, for only a few weeks. And I think it's great to have it during the off-season, because footy fans are starved for more footy. The diehard ones, the diehard fans specifically are dying for, more footy. Can't get enough of it. So the Pacific Championships is something to look forward to. So now we're moving on to some signing news. It was made official last week. Marcelo Montoya has been granted early release from the Warriors, and he has now returned with the Bulldogs and has signed with us for next year onwards. And I'm very excited from this signing. He's a Bulldogs junior. He used to play for the club. He was a great player. When he went to go to the Warriors, he had a great form. He had great seasons while he was there. And, the fact he was a Bankstown Bulls junior and playing with the club for so long and being such an integral part of the team, it's so great to welcome him home next year. And I think that's great. To me, some people have been wondering if this is a good signing or a bad signing. I think this will turn to be a good signing. I think with all the news of Adokar and that being announced that he's pretty much been told he's allowed to look around at other clubs, even though he's still got another year with us, I won't be surprised if during this off-season I cover at some point the Fox moving to another club. Well, it is a shame. Unfortunately, after what he's done to the club and embarrassed Phil Gould, it's got to happen. It's a shame, but it is what it is. And I think as much as everyone wants to bring in Blake Wilson, everyone forgets he's still quite young. And I think Phil Gould has learnt, don't rush the juniors. We've already got him signed with us till 2027. He's already loyal to the club. So if we keep him in the New South Wales Cup, we bring him in maybe during Origin period, and if players get injured, I think it's great. Keep developing him, because Wilson can become one of the best wingers in the league. He's got a lot of potential, and I'd like to keep him long term. And I think Phil Gould's got the right plan to, keep him, develop him, mature him. In the meantime, Marcelo Montoya can just come kill it for us. And I think he'll be a great combination with the likes of Bronson Xerri next to him. I think both those two will make a deadly combo. So, moving on to some very, very positive news. It was made official also last week. Shaun Johnson, after announcing his retirement and playing his last games for the Warriors and for the NRL, he is making his one last return for the Kiwis. And after Jerome Hughes has been pulled out of the side due to an injury, Shaun Johnson has accepted the call and will be taking his place. And he'll be playing for New Zealand for one last ride. And I think that is a poetic and beautiful way to finish up his career. I obviously covered, how his very last ever game for the Warriors and for the NRL was like the greatest send-off you could possibly get for a player, except for winning a premiership. So I think him getting one last chance to return for the Kiwis, represent New Zealand, put some more pride in the country than there already is, I think that's a very fitting way to wrap up what was a stellar career for SJ. So huge congratulations to him for making his return for the Kiwis. The media team for pretty much everyone has been so excited to see this return, and I'm also very excited. They don't play for another week. I think next week is their first game. And I can't wait to check out that game and watch SJ kill it. Moving on to some sadder news. Corey Oates has announced his retirement and will be... That's it. His career has now finished. I mean, congratulations on a great career, Corey Oates. He was an outstanding player. He was, I believe, one of the highest ranked try scorers for the Broncos ever, and this is a club with a very stellar roster of talent. So to have a player like Corey Oates play for so long, be a part of the club for so long, I think it's great for him. He gets to now, enjoy his post-career. He got to play 216 games for the club. Unfortunately, he didn't end the greatest of ways. He kind of became a subject of criticism and critiquing, but he's now had the chance to wrap up his career, be with his family, and look back on being a prolific try scorer for the Broncos, and one of the all-time try scorers for him. And he's a fantastic player. So enjoy retirement. Congratulations and good luck to him. Now we move on to news that, yes, people have covered it, but not to the extent I thought they would. Trent Robinson and his wife were on a trip in the Hunter Valley when I believe there was a gas explosion, and they both had to get airlifted to the hospital. And when I first read that, I was thinking, holy shit, that is huge news. The Roosters have got enough issues to deal with going into 2025. Now their coach has been airlifted to a hospital and is probably quite injured. Of course, not much else has been revealed. I'm sure, I haven't heard much about him, so, knock on wood. He's okay. He's all right. Hope he recovers well. Him and his wife, they both recover well, and he comes back and, continues coaching for the Roosters in 2025. They got a lot to deal with moving into next year. So, I thought I wanted to cover that and, wish him good luck. Hopefully he recovers well. And, also, another thing I want to cover before I get into my season review part 1. Clint Gutherson earlier this week was told by the club he can start looking around other places. And this has become a subject of two different opinions. Some people, they believe, the club is being harsh to one of their most loyal players. He's done so much for the club, and yet they're still, pretty much telling him, go look somewhere else. We don't want you anymore. And then there's the other opinion of the side saying, he's at the back end of his career. The Eels want to move in a new direction. And yes, getting rid of him probably isn't the best choice, but it's what the club wants, what the club might need in the long run. And to me, as a Doggies fan, I've obviously got a bit of a grudge against Parramatta. I still view this thing as a neutral. And there's no way going about it. Gutherson is a bit of what's the right word? He's a bit of a princess when it comes to the footy. As he was quite famously caught doing on camera, doing one of the most fakest milkings for an obstruction I've ever seen. And I think that kind of behaviour shouldn't be tolerated in the NRL. And I think Jason Riles has clearly seen that stuff and has seen his performance this year and has decided, you know what? We need to move forward in a new direction. And I think letting him go was probably the right call, in my opinion. I think him going to another club, let him kind of just play out the rest of his career. I think that's what's best. He's done tremendous work for the club. He played a big role in getting them to a grand final. Yes, they choked it and got absolutely pumped by Panthers, but what can you do? When you're Parramatta, you choke it when the game matters the most. Anyway, I'll be very curious to where he lands. I think it's either going to be Cowboys or Dragons, but you never know. Maybe some other club might snatch him up without us even realizing. So, there is one last thing I want to cover before I get into my season review of the bottom 8 teams. Over the last week, 2 separate podcasts were released. One from the Let's Trot show and the Beyond Belmore podcast. Both include Critta. And if you want an insight into the kind of man, leader, player he is, I highly recommend both those videos. Because in both videos, you get they're both about an hour. Well, no, one's about 30 minutes. The other one's just over an hour. Both of them go into great detail about who Critta is. And, you get to hear from himself how he does his leadership. The kind of leader he is. You get to see how he perceives certain losses in his career, certain wins in his career. You get to see what qualities were seen by others that made him a leader and made him the captain of our club. And it gave me such a greater insight into, who he is. And I really enjoyed listening to them on the way to work, doing stuff around the house, stuff like that. It was very enjoyable, and I highly recommend it to everyone. I actually probably post both of them on my story when I post this podcast. I'll probably also post like links to check out those videos because I thoroughly enjoyed them. I really liked them, and I think everyone who's a true Doggies fan should listen to them to get a better understanding into who their captain truly is. So now that's done, let's finally get into my season review of the bottom 4 teams. So the way I'm going to structure my season review of each team, once a week I'm going to go through the ladder, talk about the teams, just break down their seasons, give them a ranking and a rating. And since this is the first week, we'll be covering the bottom 4 teams of the NRL ladder for 2024. So that is the West Tigers, South Sydney Rabbitohs, Parramatta Eels, and the Gold Coast Titans. So starting with the very first team, the West Tigers. They placed 17th on the ladder, 6 wins, 18 losses, scored 463 points, and conceded 750 points, making them the worst defensive side in the comp this year. And when you compare that to the 2023 season, where, yes, they still came 17th, they had 2 more wins and 2 more losses. 2 less wins and 2 more losses. They scored far less, but also conceded less. Now, the stats I'm going to read off of for all these teams is brought to you by Bloke in a Bar. I'm not sponsored by them, but they did a massive season, a one big video doing a review of every team. I think it's like over 6 hours. I'm like 2 hours into it. It's thoroughly engaging, and seeing so many different people give the different perspectives. I couldn't do it in one video because I don't think I could talk for 6 hours straight. So that's why I'm breaking it up. Regardless, the stats I'm going to be reading off of were the stats they talked about. So that's where I'm getting my information from. So in terms of attacking stats, they scored on average 19 points a game. So that put them at the bottom. For their errors, they were having about 10 errors a game. They're completing at 79%, which put them at 9th. It's the defense and discipline that really cost them this year. They conceded on average 31 points a game. They missed on average 38 tackles a game. They conceded on average 6 tackles a game. They had 16 sin bins across the entire year, which was the most by, I think, a substantial margin. And send-offs, they had one only, which is second most. It's really the sin bin that you look at that across 24 games. To have 16 sin bins is outrageous. That means roughly, obviously, there's 27 weeks in the comp, but 3 of them are bye rounds, and that means they're only playing for 24 games. Meaning, if there was 16 sin bins, that means there were only 8 games this entire year where a player wasn't sin binned. Let's not forget, some of these games, players were sin binned twice. That's outrageous, in my opinion. Looking at the way their season played out, they started round 1 on the bye. Round 2, they lose to the Raiders. Round 3 and 4, they get back-to-back wins. They get probably their game of the season. They beat the Sharkies 32 points to 6 at Leichhardt. But really what their game of the year to me was the following week on Easter Monday against Parramatta, 17 points to 16. That was probably my favourite game of theirs this year, if I'm going to be honest, and one of the best games of 2024, in my opinion. Then they go on a massive losing streak. They lose to Dolphins, then the Dragons, then Panthers, then Broncos, then the Bulldogs, then Newcastle, then Dolphins, and then Cowboys. Then they get the bye. Then they get pumped by the Dragons. And then, finally round 15, they beat the Titans 18 points to 10. And then the following week, they then beat the Raiders 48-24. And then begins another losing streak. They then get pumped by Roosters, by Melbourne, by Sharks, by Souths. They lose to the Warriors. They lose to the Cowboys, Newcastle. Then, finally, they beat South Sydney in round 24. They get only their 5th win of the year. Then they beat Manly, and then probably their biggest upset of the year. They then get the bye round, and then in the Spoon Bowl, they lose to Parramatta, 22 points to 60. Like they have 60 points scored on them in their final game of the year in what was a battle for the spoon. So looking at that, like they were just in a lot of their losses. Some of them weren't even like that big of a loss. Like I'm having a look now. Like they lose by 10 to Dolphins. They lose by 12 to the Dragons. Against Panthers, they only lost by 18. Wait, no, 16. It's not that bad. Broncos pumped them. Bulldogs, they only lose by 8. Newcastle, they only lose by 6. Dolphins by 12. Cowboys, there, they pump them. Dragons pump them. Titans, they win by 8. They then actually put a bit of a thumping on the Raiders. And then it gets really bad. Like the next couple of games were really bad. 40-6 against Roosters, 28-40 against Melbourne, 58-6 against Sharks, 42-28 against Souths. Then they start, like somewhat making them close contests, like against the Warriors. And Cowboys, that was a weird one, Leichhardt. Then they get pumped by Newcastle. And then they have a very close win against Souths. And then a convincing win, in my opinion, over Manly. Then they get absolutely thrashed in the Spoon Bowl. So, I don't know. It was a very, very weird season for them. Very disappointing, to say the least. Like, very disappointing. Looking on for next year for them. Actually, no. We'll save that for another video. We're just doing a current season review for them. Very disappointing. I'd say probably their greatest, the only positive I can really give for them. They have a rising star in Lachlan Galvin. Like he was such a good player this year. Should have won Rookie of the Year in my opinion. Obviously the Dalian system couldn't have him win it, which was ridiculous. He was by far the best rookie this year, and I'm very excited to see him and Jerome Luai, how they pair up next year. And yeah, so now for the moment of truth, we're going to do my rating and ranking, my two different scores. So for the West Tigers, I'm giving them a 1 out of 10 and a score of F. They had a terrible year, winning their third consecutive wooden spoon. They had their moments, which is why I gave them a 1, but overall they were just really atrocious this year. It was disappointing. And unfortunately, they get their third consecutive wooden spoon. Moving on to the 16th placed South Sydney Rabbitohs. Their 2024 season was nothing short of a nightmare. They came 16th with only 7 wins and 17 losses. They scored 494 points and conceded 682 points. In terms of attacking stats, they scored on average 21 points a game. For errors, they had about 10 errors a game. They completed 80%. In terms of defense and discipline stats, they conceded on average 28.4 points a game, which is the third most out of any team. They missed the fourth most tackles. They conceded 6 penalties a game. They had 12 sin bins, which is the second most, just behind South Sydney. No send-offs. In terms of how their season played out, they went 3 losses in a row against Manly, Broncos, and Roosters. Then they have a bullshit win over the Bulldogs. Call me salt all you want, but they don't deserve to win that game. They then go on a bad losing streak. They get thrashed several weeks consecutively against the Warriors, the Sharks, Melbourne, Panthers, even the Dragons, Cowboys. Then finally they get a win over the Eels, 42 points to 26. Then they go on this incredible run. They win, I think, 5 in a row. They beat Eels. They beat the Titans, Broncos, Manly, Eels again. Then they lose to Dolphins. Then they beat the Tigers in round 20. And then that is it. Their last win for the season was round 20 against the Tigers. They then lose from rounds 21 and 27. They lose the rest of their games. They lose to Raiders. They lose to the Sharks. They lose to Melbourne, to Tigers, Newcastle, Panthers, and Roosters. They had a terrible, terrible fall-off in a year that was filled with several injuries to key players having off-field controversies and issues. There was the whole stuff with Latrell. The coaching staff had the whole turmoil. The players were riddled with other injuries or discipline issues. It was a chaotic year, disastrous year for a team that last year in round 11 was coming first, to then losing pretty much a lot of their games, having their coach sacked, majority of their coaching staff leave, players injured, players getting suspended for things on and off the field, absolute carnage and chaos. So for next year, I'm very curious to see where Wayne Bennett takes them. And yeah, disastrous year for South Sydney. And yeah, utter chaos. However, that brief period where they went on that 5-game win streak, that was something to behold. There was a little period where people thought maybe they might have somewhat of a chance of a comeback. Thankfully, it didn't happen. So without further ado, I'll give them their score. They scored a 3 out of 10, and they get a scoring of an F. They were terrible. From one really bad team to the next, we now move on to the Parramatta Eels. They came 15th on the ladder with 7 wins and 17 losses. They scored 561 points, but conceded 716 points. You look back, 2 years ago they were in a grand final. 2 years later they are now playing for a wooden spoon. Shocking downfall for Parramatta Eels. In terms of attacking stats, they on average were scoring 23 points a game for errors, about roughly 11 errors a game. In terms of defense and discipline, they conceded 29.8 points a game, the second most behind the Tigers. They missed the most tackles per game with 39. They conceded on average 5 penalties a game. They had 8 sin wins across the whole year, which was the 4th most. No send-offs. In terms of how their draw played out, they win against the Bulldogs, lose against Panthers, win against Manly, back-to-back losses to Tigers and Raiders, and this is where everything starts to go downhill. They beat Cowboys, and then the downfall begins. They then lose to Dolphins 44-16. Manly beat them. They have the bye. Broncos beat them. Storm beat them. Souths beat them. They have a shocking win against the Sharks. Then they have a loss against the Bulldogs, which was, in my opinion, the game of the year. They then lose to Roosters. They have the bye. Then they lose to Newcastle, Souths, Titans. They have the bye. They lose to Storm. They beat the Warriors. They lose to Panthers, Roosters, Broncos, Dragons. Panthers, Roosters, Broncos. Then they beat Dragons and they beat Tigers to just dodge the wooden spoon. The only way I can describe this year, disastrous. Absolute disaster. And I know they had key injuries. Again, Mitch Moses was out from, I believe, round 4 to round... there's a read-through. Round 13, he made his returns. He was gone for 10 weeks. Then he, came to Origin, did the magical stuff that he did. But then, tears his bicep, which then rules him out for the rest of the year, which then puts them into utter chaos. And as much as I took joy in laughing at them, it's still a shame to watch a club, collapse like that. And then the second of Brad Arthur, halfway through the year, was in really poor taste. This guy was playing with... He was coaching a squad that was riddled with injuries, struggling to even have 18 players, to have a full roster of players even playing. You can't fully blame him for what happened. And I feel like they used him as a bit of a scapegoat. But they've made the call to sack him. And now Jason Rolls is doing a bit of a clean out with the likes of Clint Gutherson and a few other players. RCG as well. And then they have the huge blunder of getting rid of Blaze Talangi, who could have been an absolute star for him, but is now going to Panthers and will probably become the next number 6 for him to replace Jerome Luai. But we'll see what happens to him. However, they do get the bonus of getting Zach Lomax coming to the side next year, which I will cover in my preview for each team in 2025. So, overall, for the Parramatta Eels, I'm going to give them a 2 out of 10. Even though they came 15th above Souths, I think they had a far worse of a year. To be that close to a wooden spoon, at one point they were last. They were atrocious. They had maybe a couple of good games this year. Other than that, they were atrocious. They were terrible. And yeah, I'm giving them a 2 out of 10 and a score of an F. Now we move on to the last team of the bottom 4, the Gold Coast Titans. what could be one of the most disappointing teams of the year after having such high hopes. They came 14th on the ladder with 8 wins and 16 losses. They scored 488 points. It conceded 656. So in terms of attacking stats, they scored 20.3 points a game. So about 20 points. For errors, they had 9 per game, which was the most amount of errors. They completed 82%. In terms of discipline and defense, they conceded on average 27.3 points a game. They missed 35 tackles per game, conceded 5 penalties per game. They had 3 sin bins across the whole year, which is the second least amount of sin bins per year. No send-offs. How their draw played out was something to behold. They go rounds 1 through 7 straight losses. Yes, they had a bye round 2, but it was just constant losses and they weren't close. They lose 28-4 against the Dragons round 1. Round 3, they get pumped by the Doggies 32-0 at Belmore. They lose by 16 to the Dolphins. Cowboys beat them 35-22. Then finally, against Manly and Raiders, they have some close losses. And then they finally get their first win of 2024 and they beat the Warriors in New Zealand by 3 points. They then go on to have a bit of a win-loss thing. They lose to Melbourne, they beat the Cowboys, lose to Newcastle, beat the Broncos. Then they have a bye. Then they lose to Souths and Tigers. Then they have the greatest game in the club's history and beat the Warriors 66-6. They then have a bye. They beat the Sharks. They beat Eels. Yes, they lose to Manly, but then they beat Dolphins and Broncos. Like, they go on this really good run where there is somewhat of a chance they might make the 8. However, that win against the Broncos was their last ever win for the season. Very similar to how the South Sydney Rabbitohs played out. They then lose to Sharks, Dragons, Roosters, Knights, and Panthers. They kind of gave up by this point. Shocking end to their season. And it was Des Hasler's first year as coach. They had their captain, Tino, do his ACL in round 3, which rules him out for the rest of the year. They then deal with the whole Keanu Kinney and AJ Brimson problem, where they're undecisive on where each of them will fit in the squad. And it's so chaotic. However, a shining light for them was Alofiana Khan-Pereira, who, was the top try scorer for 2024. And moving to next year, they don't have any. I think their biggest signing was probably RCG. Besides that, nothing major. And yeah, it was a very disappointing year. There was all this rumors that they could have been a dark horse for the year. There was a chance they could have made the 8. But in Titans fashion, they disappointed their fans and their NRL community, and they did not have a good year. However, I believe things might change next year. Bit of a hint into my discussions for my previews for 2025. So now I got to give them a ranking and a rating. I'm going to give the Titans a 3.5 out of 10, and the only team to score an E on this entire list. And as much as I would absolutely love to continue talking about each of every team and go through their entire ladder, I would like to save those for another video. So there you have it. That is the first for part 1 of 5 for my review of each team's 2024 season. I've now covered the Tigers, the Bunnies, the Eels, and the Titans. Moving on to next week, I'll be covering the Warriors, the Broncos, the Dragons, and the Dolphins. So the middle 4 teams of the ladder. And I believe with that, we might be done for today. Alright, everybody. Thank you for listening to episode 11 of the Wild Doggies Fan podcast. If you're new here, please like the video, comment down below, subscribe, and stay tuned for all future videos. Also, please go follow me on Instagram at the Wild Doggies Fan. I just recently posted a Jacob Curat's edit, which is nearly at 10,000 views and nearly 500 likes. Thank you to everyone who has liked it and has checked out that post. Please check out the rest of my posts. Please follow me over there. We're so close to 100 followers. That is the end goal for 2024, to get to 100 followers. We're nearly there. 16 more to go. Thank you all for listening. Hope you enjoyed this episode. I know I did. Looking forward to next week, where I'll be covering the Pacific Championships week 1, my tips for week 2, any news stories that happen between now and next week, and a season review for the Warriors, Broncos, Dragons, and Dolphins. So, once again, thank you all for listening to this episode, and I'll see you all next week for another episode of the Wild Doggies Fan podcast.